Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at an event from last December, the U.S. organized Summit for Democracy.
That's right. It was presented as this major push, the U.S. rallying democracies worldwide.
But the academic analysis we're focusing on today tells a pretty different story.
It really does. Our source material is quite critical. It's an in-depth assessment from Chinese academics, specifically featured on the China Now show.
And they argue the summit wasn't just a minor miss, but a significant failure, tactically and strategically.
Yeah, their core finding, yes.
Okay, so our mission here is clear. We're going to unpack this specific viewpoint. We want to understand exactly why these analysts believe the summit failed.
And what flaws they think it revealed about the U.S. political system itself.
Right, and crucially, how this apparent ideological failure might shape U.S. strategy moving forward, especially concerning China.
And we need to be really clear with you, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
We're analyzing their arguments impartially. We're not endorsing these conclusions, just exploring them.
Absolutely. Strictly reporting on the source material. So let's start with the summit itself. The analysts were less than impressed.
That's putting it mildly. They noted it started hastily and ended hastily. Basically, it didn't even achieve its most fundamental aim,
Which was it?
producing some kind of joint declaration or even just a meaningful consensus among the attendees. It just didn't happen.
They used a couple of quite vivid Chinese idioms to describe this, didn't they? The first one captured the sort of anti-climax.
Yeah, it came like a storm, departed like a shadow, describes how it had all this build-up, this fanfare, and then just vanished. Poof.
Fizzled out.
Exactly. And the second idiom was even more pointed about America's standing.
What was that one again?
Low prestige, few words of advice. The suggestion being the U.S. just didn't have the clout, the moral authority maybe, to really lead this thing effectively.
And they didn't just state this, they backed it up with evidence, right?
Right.
Indicators of failure.
Oh, yes. Specific metrics, like really low public engagement. They mentioned the YouTube peak viewership, barely hit 20,000 people.
Wow, for a global summit, that's tiny.
It is. And perhaps more telling, according to them, was the silence from major U.S. and Western media outlets.
Why was that significant?
Their interpretation was that the media itself recognized it was, a sinking ship and basically decided not to give it much airtime to avoid highlighting the failure.
Interesting. They also mentioned something about the delegates themselves, apathy.
Yeah, a lot of representatives apparently just gave these very brief, sort of perfunctory statements like they were just checking a box.
But wasn't there one standout moment, an anecdote involving Argentina?
Ah, yes. The president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez. According to the source, he used his speaking time not to praise the initiative, but to openly criticize the U.S.
Criticize the host at their own summit.
Exactly. The analysts described that as something unimaginable just a decade or two ago. They see it as proof that the global deference to the U.S., or perhaps fear of crossing it, has really diminished.
So putting all that together, what was their final verdict on the summit?
Pretty damning. They concluded the summit effectively stripped the U.S. of its emperor's new clothes.
Meaning it exposed the reality behind the image.
Precisely. That the whole American democracy myth, as they call it, is essentially bankrupt. And they even brought in U.S. polling data.
Oh, what did that show?
They cited a figure 72% of Americans believe U.S. democracy is no longer a model for the world.
72%. That's a huge number.
It is. And the analyst's point is, if your own citizens have lost faith to that extent, how can you convincingly sell that model internationally? It just doesn't track.
Okay, that makes sense. And that seems to lead directly into their broader critique, moving beyond just the summit itself.
Yes, into their deconstruction of what they term liberal democracy.
What's their main issue with it?
Their core argument is that it puts, an enormous emphasis on procedural justice.
Meaning the process, elections, legal frameworks, that sort of thing.
Exactly, the rituals of democracy. And they argue this focus is used, maybe even deliberately, to mask or ignore substantive injustice.
Okay, explain that distinction, procedure versus substance. What does substantive injustice mean in their analysis?
It refers to the real-world outcomes. Things like massive economic inequality, the lack of universal health care, deep-seated poverty, systemic racism. They argue the system, by focusing on the procedures of elections and law, fails to actually address these fundamental substantive problems
because the system serves the elite.
That's their claim. They describe it as freedom wrapped in a democratic coat, but argue this freedom primarily acts as a protective charm for the capitalist elite.
So the procedures protect the status quo, even if the outcomes are unfair for many.
That's the essence of their critique,
Hmm.
which leads them to argue that democracy, or at least this form of it, isn't the same as good governance.
And they connect this to money in politics.
Directly. They say the U.S. concept of one person, one vote is, in practice, much closer to $1, one vote.
Because money influences campaigns, lobbying.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they detail what they see as inherent flaws in this mass election model. They argue it's easily manipulated and that specific local or special interests can effectively hijack the national interest.
Which leads to
Political polarization, constant infighting, fiscal problems, and what the sources rather cynically call political entertainment instead of effective problem solving.
They mentioned a specific term for this infighting, veto politics.
Yes, veto politics. In their view, it's a system where entrenched interests, partisan, corporate, whatever, can easily block any significant reform that might challenge their position.
So legislative gridlock becomes the norm.
Essentially, yes, it prevents substantive change on major issues, which brings them to a really provocative argument.
Which is?
They argue that liberal democracy, as practiced in the West, actually has no direct link to the things often claimed for it, like economic development, technological progress, or general public welfare.
Wow, so they're decoupling democracy from progress? How do they explain Western advancement then?
They reframe it entirely. They contend that major leaps in science and tech in the West weren't primarily driven by democratic ideals, but by military competition stemming from centuries of war.
Conflict is the engine of innovation, not democracy.
That's their controversial take, yes. It's a fundamental challenge to the usual narrative.
It certainly is. And they seem to wrap up this section with a rather pointed comment about recent U.S. presidents.
Oh, absolutely. Very sarcastic. They basically say that the actions of Trump, who they claim pierced almost every mask of American democracy, combined with Biden's summit exposing the myth, well, that this combination did more to deconstruct the Western narrative than decades of work by dozens of professors.
So the system's own recent history is its harshest critic, in their view.
That's precisely their point. But then comes a crucial turn in their analysis. They warn against feeling, too comfortable or celebratory about this ideological failure.
Why? Because failure in one area doesn't mean the U.S. just gives up.
Exactly. The failure of the democracy angle doesn't mean an end to U.S. exertion of power. They predict a shift in strategy.
Towards what?
They argue that since the soft power approach, the democracy promotion strategy, has been exposed as ineffective, the U.S. ruling class is likely to pivot.
Pivot to
what they call more barbaric attacks on China. They foresee an escalation focusing on harder power tools.
like trade wars,
Yeah.
geopolitical maneuvering.
Yes. Trade wars, intensifying geopolitical conflict, aggressive industrial and tech competition, and quite worryingly, they suggest a heightened risk of military adventurism.
That sounds like they're predicting a more desperate, potentially reckless approach.
They framed it historically. They recall a warning that a young, rising U.S. with immense power was unsettling.
And now?
Now they ask, could an older, declining U.S. facing the failure of its ideological project become more desperate, more crazy, and without a bottom line?
That's a chilling question. They connect this to a broader theory of Western history, don't they? Something about deep breaths.
Yes, it's a historical framework they use. They summarize Western civilization's growth through three major expansionary phases, or deep breaths.
Okay, let's break those down. What are these historical phases?
The first involved the aftermath of barbarian invasions, leading to land acquisition within Europe. The second was the Crusades, which they argue brought back wealth and technology from the East.
And the third?
The age of navigation and colonization, global expansion. The key point for them is that all three phases were based on outward expansion, exploiting external resources or peoples, and essentially exporting internal pressures.
Okay, I see the pattern. So how does that relate to the present situation?
They argue that Western civilization is approaching the end of another roughly 500-year cycle and faces a similar choice: internal stagnation or expansion.
But where can it expand now?
Well, geographically, they argue China is seen as the only major area left for significant external expansion or dominance. And even in New Frontier's digital space, they see the U.S. encountering strong Chinese competition.
So the U.S. ruling class faces a stark choice, in their view.
Yes. Either accept a decline in global hegemony and focus on internal reform, or, as they put it, go all in on attacks against China to try and maintain dominance.
That's a heavy prediction. Let's shift back to the summit itself for a moment. The source material also criticized the practical aspects, like the invitation list.
Absolutely. They argued the list was transparently political. It wasn't really about democratic credentials, but about lining up allies, specifically against China.
Any specific examples they highlighted?
Several. Hungary, for instance,
Yeah.
an EU member, but excluded. Why? Because of its friendly ties with China and Russia. They even quote an alleged U.S. official calling PM Orban a mini Putin.
So, geopolitics trumped democratic status.
Clearly, in their analysis. Same with Turkey excluded, due to really strained relations over various issues like a past coup attempt the U.S. was allegedly linked to, and Turkey buying Russian missiles.
And what about inclusions? Any surprises there?
Singapore was one they noted. Traditionally, the U.S. hadn't classified Singapore as a democracy, often citing its founder Lee Kuan Yew's own rejection of Western models for Asia. Yet, Singapore was invited.
Suggesting the criteria were flexible, depending on strategic goals?
That's the implication. They also mentioned Pakistan, which was invited but chose not to attend, likely seeing it, according to the analysts, as an anti-China gathering they didn't want to be part of.
This focus on strategic maneuvering brings us to the money aspect. There was a question in the original source discussion about funding.
Yes, a student asked about the Biden administration's plan to commit, I think it was $424 million for democratic renewal globally. Things like supporting journalists, aiding activists.
How did the analysts view that fund? As a genuine effort to help?
Not at all. They were extremely cynical. First, they called the amount relatively small, just a piece of meat thrown out.
A piece of meat for whom?
For opportunists, they argued. But more fundamentally, they predicted most of it would just be absorbed by what they termed the deep state.
How are they defining deep state in this context? It's a loaded term.
They define it quite specifically here as the intersection of Wall Street finance, the military-industrial complex, and the ecosystem of NGOs often involved in foreign interventions.
And the argument is that these groups profit from instability.
Yes, that they profit from things like regime change efforts or geopolitical disruption rather than fostering genuine, stable democracy. The money, they suggest, doesn't really go to the stated goals.
Do they give an example of this opportunism?
They point to Lithuania. Apparently, after Lithuania took a strong stance on Taiwan, annoying Beijing, they quickly sought some of this funding. The analysts see this as a clear case of a country aligning with U.S. geopolitical aims for financial benefit, not out of some deep democratic conviction.
Okay. This leads us towards the end to a direct comparison of political systems. They contrasted the U.S. two-party system with China's model.
They did. Their critique of the U.S. system is that it's designed to openly represent sectional interests. They call the parties partial interest parties.
Meaning they represent specific groups or regions, not the whole country.
Exactly. And they argue this structure inevitably leads to the veto politics we discussed earlier, gridlock, inability to act for the common good, because these partial interests block each other. It can't overcome entrenched vested interests.
And how did they describe China's system in contrast?
They termed the CCP an overall interest party. Their argument is that because it aims to represent the whole nation's long-term interests, it can overcome internal opposition from specific groups or vested interests to push through major reforms quickly.
Did they offer an example to illustrate this difference in capability?
Yes, a very concrete one.
Healthcare.
They contrasted the century-long struggle in the U.S. to establish universal health care, which is still debated.
With China's experience.
Right. They pointed out that after deciding to do it around 2003, China managed to establish basic universal health insurance covering most of its vast population in just 5 or 6 years.
Highlighting speed and the ability to implement large-scale national projects.
Exactly. The focus, in their view, is on substantive results and rapid execution once a national goal is set.
So, after all this critique, did the analysts offer any kind of positive path forward, particularly for the U.S.?
Interestingly, yes. They outline what they called a potential third path, but it's explicitly framed as a path for the American people, not necessarily for the current ruling elite.
What does this people's path involve?
It's focused inward, exploring what they call genuine democracy, ensuring people's rights, reforming the electoral system they see as corrupt, and addressing the judiciary, which they term dark.
When they say dark judiciary, what are they getting at?
They seem to be pointing to a legal system they view as overly focused on technicalities, potentially protecting elite interests, and failing to deliver, substantive social justice or equality for ordinary people. It connects back to that procedure versus substance critique.
Okay, what else is part of this proposed path?
Things like abolishing the Federal Reserve System, a very radical suggestion reflecting deep distrust of the financial system, but mainly building a responsible government focused squarely on domestic problems.
Like what?
The urgent stuff. Pandemic response, fixing infrastructure, tackling poverty and crime, and genuinely working to eliminate racism. A real focus on improving lives within the U.S.
And internationally, does this path involve isolation?
No, not isolation, but cooperation. Specifically, they suggest cooperation with China, particularly on new frontiers. They echo the old idea that the Pacific is big enough for both China and the U.S.
But update it.
Right. They say today, the digital and space frontiers are even bigger, offering vast potential for shared exploration and development, moving away from this zero-sum conflict model.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. The core argument from these academic sources, the ones we've examined today, is that the Summit for Democracy wasn't just an event that didn't go well.
No, it was much more significant in their view. They see it as a moment of profound self-exposure for the U.S.
Where its claims to global leadership and the underlying weaknesses of its own democratic model were laid bare for the world to see. A critical failure, not just a diplomatic one.
Exactly, a failure of the narrative, of the ideology itself. Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to consider, drawn directly from their analysis.
Go on.
The sources warn that declining great powers can become desperate, unpredictable. If the U.S. ruling class, as these analysts suggest, now sees that its ideological strategy, its democracy promotion, is failing,
Then what?
will it choose that third path? The one focused on cooperation abroad and serious domestic reform, the one they suggest benefits the American people.
Or will it double down on the other path, the one involving intensified trade wars, tech battles, geopolitical conflict, maybe even military risks?
Which choice, at the end of the day, truly benefits the people of the U.S., and indeed the people of the world? That's the question their analysis leaves us with.